Moving from America to Mexico changed me so deeply that I barely recognize myself anymore. Nobody tells you what really happens after you leave America and live in Mexico long term. After a while, I started noticing something unsettling. I looked at myself and realized I barely recognized who I had become. We dive into the emotional, financial, and lifestyle changes Americans experience after moving abroad, using data from the Earth Awaits, Numbeo, and livingcost.org. Stay until the end to discover the unexpected reason I no longer recognize myself after relocating to Mexico. The scariest part about leaving America wasn't moving to Mexico. It was realizing I brought the same unhappy version of myself with me. When I first arrived in Mexico, everything felt magical. The slower mornings, the cheaper food, the warm weather, the colorful streets. It felt like I had finally escaped the stress and emptiness I carried back in America. Deep down, I believed moving to a new country would automatically create a new life. I thought changing my location would somehow change me. That was the first mistake. A lot of Americans move abroad with an escape mindset. They're burned out, lonely, financially overwhelmed, or emotionally exhausted, and they secretly hope a new country will erase those feelings. I did the same thing. I romanticized reinvention. I imagined myself becoming calmer, happier, more adventurous, more fulfilled overnight, simply because I was living somewhere different. And at first, it almost works. Everything feels exciting because it's unfamiliar. You're distracted by the novelty of the new culture, the food, the language, the scenery. But eventually, normal life catches up to you again. The excitement fades. Your routines return. Your thoughts return too. That's when I start noticing something strange. Even though I was living in a place people dream about, I still felt restless sometimes. I still overthought things. I still felt uncertain about who I was and what I actually wanted. Mexico had changed my environment, but it hadn't magically healed me. That's when I learned a hard truth. A new environment can expose your problems, not erase them. In fact, moving abroad can magnify parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Without familiar routines and distractions, you're left face to face with yourself. And honestly, that realization changed me more than the move itself ever did. At first, living in Mexico felt like I had finally escaped the rigid structure of American life. Back in America, my days were controlled by alarms, deadlines, traffic, bills, schedules, and constant pressure to stay productive. So when I moved abroad, I promised myself I would finally live freely. No more strict routines, no more overplanning, no more feeling trapped inside the same exhausting cycle every day. And honestly, in the beginning, it felt incredible. I would wake up whenever I wanted, work when I felt inspired, wander through the city without a plan, and spend entire afternoons doing absolutely nothing. Every day felt open-ended, flexible, limitless. I convinced myself this was what real freedom looked like. But slowly, something started changing. Without realizing it, I had completely lost structure. My sleep schedule became inconsistent. My productivity became unpredictable. Some days blended together so much that I couldn't even remember what I had accomplished that week. The freedom I once craved slowly turned into a drifting lifestyle. That's the strange part nobody talks about after moving abroad long term. When you suddenly remove all structure from your life, you also remove the systems that keep you mentally grounded. There's no external pressure forcing you to stay disciplined anymore. No familiar routine anchoring your days together. And if you're not careful, you can slowly start floating through life without direction. I remember sitting alone at a cafe one afternoon, realizing I had spent weeks living freely, but somehow felt more mentally scattered than ever before. That realization hit me hard. At first, freedom feels amazing. Eventually, too much freedom can start feeling unstable. That was one of the biggest lessons Mexico taught me. Freedom without structure doesn't always create peace. Sometimes it creates confusion. And the longer I stayed abroad, the more I realized I didn't just need freedom. I needed balance. Stick around as we center on what could happen if you build life around comfort instead of purpose. The most dangerous thing about my life in Mexico was that it became almost too comfortable. At first, that comfort felt like success. My cost of living was lower, my stress levels dropped, and everyday life felt easier than it ever did in America. I could afford better meals, nicer apartments, more free time, and experiences that once felt financially impossible back home. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly worrying about survival. And honestly, that felt incredible. My routines became simple and predictable. Morning coffee at the same cafe, long walks through familiar streets, cheap dinners, slow afternoons, easy conversations. Life stopped feeling like a constant uphill battle, and I started believing this was the happiness I had been searching for all along. But after a while, I noticed something uncomfortable. I had built my entire lifestyle around convenience, around avoiding stress, around staying comfortable. Without realizing it, I stopped pushing myself. I stopped setting meaningful goals. I stopped chasing growth because life had become so easy to maintain. Every day felt pleasant, but strangely repetitive. Weeks blurred together, and deep down, I started feeling emotionally flat. That's the part many people never talk about when they move abroad. A cheap lifestyle and constant convenience can quietly lull you into complacency. You become so focused on protecting your peace that you stop challenging yourself entirely, and eventually, comfort can become its own kind of trap. I remember sitting on my balcony one evening thinking, why do I feel so empty when my life finally looks good on paper? That question stayed with me for months. I became comfortable, but not necessarily fulfilled. That realization changed the way I viewed happiness completely, because fulfillment doesn't automatically come from escaping stress or lowering your expenses. Sometimes purpose requires discomfort, discipline, challenge, and growth. And the longer I lived abroad, the more I realized comfort alone could never replace meaning. Nobody warns you how strange it feels when your old life slowly stops feeling like yours. When I first moved to Mexico, staying connected to home felt easy. I called family regularly, texted old friends, kept up with everyone online, and told myself nothing would really change between us. I thought distance was just physical. I assumed the relationships, routines, and identity I built in America would still be waiting for me whenever I returned. But little by little, things started shifting. Family conversations became shorter and less frequent. Friends back home moved on with their own lives, relationships, careers, routines, and inside jokes that no longer included me. Every time I visited America again, something felt slightly unfamiliar. Places looked the same, but I didn't feel the same inside them anymore. That realization hit me harder than I expected. At the same time, I still didn't fully feel Mexican either. I was living abroad, adapting to a different culture, building new habits, and changing as a person. But part of me still felt like an outsider. I existed somewhere in between two versions of life. And honestly, that in-between feeling can become emotionally exhausting. You start questioning where you truly belong. Back home, people think you've changed too much. Abroad, you still feel somewhat disconnected from the culture around you. It creates this quiet identity shift that happens so slowly you barely notice it until one day it suddenly becomes obvious. I remember walking through my hometown during a visit back to America and feeling like I was observing my old life instead of living inside it. That feeling stayed with me long after I returned to Mexico. You start realizing you don't fully belong to your old life anymore, but you also haven't fully built a new one. That's one of the hardest emotional realities of living abroad long term. Sometimes the move changes you so deeply that home itself starts feeling unfamiliar. Keep watching to find out what mistaking peace for progress can do to you. The most confusing part of living abroad was realizing that feeling calm didn't always mean I was growing. When I first moved to Mexico, the slower lifestyle felt healing. Life wasn't constantly rushing anymore. There were fewer deadlines, fewer financial pressures, fewer expectations pulling me in every direction. Compared to the nonstop stress I experienced in America, everything finally felt quiet. And for a while, that quiet felt like freedom. I started sleeping better. My anxiety dropped. My days became slower, softer, more manageable. I convinced myself I had finally discovered the secret to happiness. Escape the pressure, simplify your life, and protect your peace at all costs. But eventually, I noticed another shift happening underneath the surface. The less pressure I felt, the less ambitious I became. Goals that once excited me suddenly felt exhausting. I stopped challenging myself because I no longer had external pressure forcing me forward. Instead of building momentum, I started maintaining comfort. Every day felt peaceful, but also strangely stagnant. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. One afternoon, I caught myself avoiding opportunities simply because they seemed stressful or inconvenient. A few years earlier, I would have embraced those challenges without hesitation. But now, all I wanted was ease, comfort, and stability. That's when a difficult thought crossed my mind. Sometimes what feels like peace is actually avoidance. That sentence stayed with me because deep down, I knew it was true. I wasn't just escaping stress anymore. I was also avoiding discomfort, uncertainty, risk, and growth. The slower lifestyle that once felt healthy had quietly started shrinking my sense of ambition. And honestly, that scared me. This was the moment I started questioning who I was becoming, because there's a difference between healing and hiding, and living abroad forced me to confront that difference in a way I never expected. Make sure to watch all the way through. You won't believe what we found to happen should you drift into an expat bubble living abroad. The strangest part of living abroad was realizing how easy it was to build a life that looked exciting, but felt emotionally shallow. When I first moved to Mexico, meeting other expats felt comforting. We all shared similar stories. People escaping stress, chasing freedom, searching for a better quality of life. At first, it felt like instant community. We spent afternoons at cafes, worked remotely from the same spots, talked about cheap living, travel plans, and how different life felt compared to America. And honestly, it felt good to belong somewhere again. But after enough time passed, I started noticing how repetitive everything had become. The same conversations, the same routines, the same cycle every week. Coffee shops, co-working spaces, weekend trips, beach towns, cheap food, late night conversations about leaving America behind. It looked like freedom from the outside, but internally, my life had quietly entered a loop. Most of my relationships also stayed surface level. People came and went constantly. Some stayed for a few months, others for a year, but very few connections became truly deep or lasting. Everyone was living temporarily, even when they claimed they were building a permanent life abroad. That instability slowly started affecting me more than I realized. I remember sitting at dinner with a group of expats one night, listening to the exact same conversations I'd heard dozens of times before, and suddenly feeling emotionally disconnected from all of it. That moment stayed with me. I realized I wasn't building a deeper life. I was just maintaining a comfortable one. That truth hit hard because comfort can easily disguise stagnation. I had built routines that protected me from stress, but they also protected me from growth, vulnerability, and deeper purpose. Living abroad had given me freedom, but somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I was actually evolving, or simply staying busy inside a lifestyle that felt easy to maintain. You'll want to see what happens should you not realize that moving abroad magnifies your habits. The hardest truth I discovered in Mexico was that moving abroad doesn't hide your habits, it exposes them. When I first left America, I genuinely believed a new country would reshape me into a different person. I thought the environment alone would make me more disciplined, adventurous, fulfilled, and emotionally balanced. But after enough time abroad, I started noticing something uncomfortable. The same habits I had back home were still following me, just in different forms. If I isolated myself in America, I isolated myself in Mexico too. Except now, the isolation felt deeper because I was far away from family, old friends, and familiar routines. Some days, entire weekends would pass without meaningful conversation. And because everything around me looked beautiful, I convinced myself I was fine. My financial habits followed me too. Even though life was cheaper, I still avoided long-term planning. I spent money emotionally at times, justified unnecessary expenses because the cost felt lower, and treated affordability like freedom instead of responsibility. Then there were the emotional patterns, the overthinking, the uncertainty, the constant search for fulfillment. Those things didn't disappear after moving abroad. In some ways, they became louder because I finally had enough silence to notice them clearly. That's when I understood something that completely changed my perspective. Moving abroad doesn't change your identity automatically, it amplifies the way you already live. That realization hit me hard because it forced me to stop blaming the environment for the confusion I felt inside. And then came the moment that changed everything for me. That's when I realized Mexico wasn't changing me. My lack of direction was. The country itself wasn't the problem. The deeper issue was that I had moved without fully understanding who I wanted to become. I had been chasing escape instead of clarity. And that realization completely changed how I think about living abroad. Because no matter where you go, you eventually meet yourself there. You will be utterly amazed to find out why I didn't recognize myself anymore at this point. The moment I truly didn't recognize myself anymore wasn't sudden. It was the result of 1,000 small choices I didn't fully understand at the time. And it's important to say this clearly. It's not because Mexico ruined my life. It's because I confused escape with transformation. I thought freedom without structure would make me happy. I thought comfort without growth would feel fulfilling. I thought cheap living would naturally lead to intentional living. But instead, those things quietly pulled me into a version of life that felt easier, but not necessarily deeper. That's when everything started to blur. The excitement of moving abroad faded, and what was left was a lifestyle that felt stable on the surface, but directionless underneath. I wasn't actively building something. I was simply reacting to whatever felt convenient in the moment. And looking back, I realized something bigger. The biggest mistake Americans make abroad is building a lifestyle around escape instead of purpose. Because escape feels like progress at first, it feels like healing, it feels like freedom. But without direction, escape eventually becomes repetition. You stop moving forward and start maintaining comfort instead of creating meaning. If I could do it all again, there are 3 things I would prioritize from day one. First, I would build purpose before lifestyle. Not just choosing a country because it looks beautiful or affordable, but because I had a clear direction for what I wanted my life to become. Scenery fades, purpose doesn't. Second, I would create structure immediately. Freedom sounds amazing, but without boundaries, it slowly turns into drift. Even simple routines would have kept me grounded and intentional. Third, I would focus on growth, not just comfort. I would make decisions that challenge me, not just make life easier, because ease without direction eventually becomes stagnation. The truth is, the people who thrive abroad aren't just escaping their old life. They're intentionally building a new one. And that distinction changes everything. Mexico can absolutely change your life in ways you never imagined, from your daily routine to your sense of freedom and perspective on what matters most. But the biggest changes aren't always the ones you expect when you first make the move. Often, it's the internal shifts, your habits, mindset, and identity that end up transforming you far more than the external lifestyle ever does. If you're curious about the real, unfiltered experience of living in Mexico long term, watch our other videos where we break down what everyday life actually looks like for expats who stay for good.